And we are in, we're looking at the prophets, an overview of the prophets. And particularly tonight, we're going to zero in on Elisha. We looked at Elijah last week, and this week we're going to zero in on the prophet Elisha. One of the things that I was asked as we sort of started this is kind of to give a little bit of a view of where the prophets lived in time and related to what. So that was why I sent the kind of timeline several weeks ago. Elisha is in the time, the second half of the 9th century BC. So the 800s, 850 down to about 800 BC. He ministered while Ahaziah was king, while Joram in the north was king, while Jehu in the north was king, Jehoahaz and Jehoash, and in the south, Jehoshaphat, Jehoram or Joram. There's a northern Joram and a southern Joram, which makes things kind of difficult. And they also reigned about the same time, so that's kind of makes things a little tough. But also Ahaziah, Athaliah, and Joash in the southern kingdom. So 800 to about 850 to about 800 is when BC is when he was ministering. He's a little earlier than Isaiah, and so we kind of begin looking at Elisha in 1 Kings 19. We'll take a look at that in just a second. During the time Elisha was prophesying, there were several different revolts against Israel. Israel had, by Elisha's day, kind of come to dominate some of the kingdoms around them. They'd become powerful enough that they had sort of puppet kings on the throne in some other kingdoms around them. There was a revolt against Israel by the kingdom of Moab, and Joram of Israel and Jehoshaphat of Judah and the king of Edom at the time invaded and to put down the rebellion. You can read this in 2 Kings 3. They got out into the desert of Edom and started running low on water. And they called Elisha, and Elisha showed up and said, "Don't worry, tomorrow morning God's going to send water." And the next morning there was water there in the desert where there hadn't been, and so they were able then to overcome Moab. There's a whole story there, but there was lots of intrigue, as there always was in the ancient Near East, between kings and kingdoms. There was an assassination in Aram, just north of Israel. The king Ben-Hadad was murdered by Hazael during Elisha's ministry. So there was that. Jehoram of Judah, who was king for 11 years, married a descendant of King Ahab, a daughter of King Ahab, Athaliah, and probably did this to gain some influence over Israel, but that wound up opening the door for Athaliah to later come and reign in Judah for about 6 or 7 years. Kind of a spectacular backfire of that plan. Elisha also had Jehu. He had Jehu anointed king with the commission to wipe out the house of Ahab. If you may remember under Elijah, Ahab had sort of been put on probation, sort of, or I guess maybe his punishment of his house had been sort of deferred, and Jehu became the instrument of God to take care of that. Though other texts, including Joel and some other prophets kind of suggest that he maybe went a little overboard in his uh, destruction of the house of Ahab. But God uses him to avenge the murders of many faithful Israelites and prophets. He also happens to kill Ahaziah of Judah, which opens the door for Athaliah, which we can talk about in a few minutes. So that's a little bit of what's going on during the time of Elisha's ministry. A lot happening, a lot of intrigue, a lot of political assassinations, and the rise and fall of empires. One of the things that also happened is something called the Battle of Karkar. You may have heard of the Battle of Karkar. It's historically somewhat significant, though kind of indecisive. It happened in 853, right about the time Elisha was beginning his ministry, or maybe just a little before. And it was the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III fighting against Ben-Hadad of Aram. And I think it was like nine other, Ben-Hadad of Aram and Ahab of Israel, and I think nine other kingdoms allied against Assyria. And again, I think it was kind of an indecisive battle. Of course, the Assyrians, Shalmaneser said he won and wiped them all out, but Shalmaneser always said that. And nothing really changed politically at the time, but it sort of marked the rise of Assyria's coming to power. And you can read about the Battle of Karkar on Wikipedia if you want. There's a little bit there. So maybe that gives you a little bit of an overview what's going on in the world as Elisha takes on this responsibility to be the prophet. And we can start by reading in 1 Kings 19, read 19 through 21 for us.
So Elijah went from there and found Elisha, son of Shaphat. He was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen, and he himself was driving the 12th pair. Elijah went up to him and threw his cloak around him. Elisha then left his oxen and ran after Elijah. "Let me kiss my father and mother goodbye," he said, "and then I will come with you." "Go back," Elijah replied. "What have I done to you?" So Elisha left him and went back. He took his yoke of oxen and slaughtered them. He burned the plowing equipment to cook the meat and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he set out to follow Elijah and became his attendant.
So apparently that's how you become the apprentice to a prophet. You get to be his attendant for a while. And so Elisha does that role. He's later described as he poured water on the hands of Elijah, which I don't know exactly what that means, but it kind of grabs sort of gets the idea across, right? He was the one who served. He took care of what Elijah needed, the day-to-day sort of things that Elijah needed. He was the one to take care of those things. And as he did so, he was learning what it was to be a prophet and watching Elijah. And why did Elijah do that, by the way? Why did he go and choose Elisha? Just drew a name out of a hat? What? You may remember after he met with God on Mount Horeb, and God told him he needs to get up off his rear end and get back to work. And one of the things he was told to do is anoint Elisha as his successor. And so that's the first thing we see him do after he leaves Horeb. So literally,
what's the difference in the meaning of their names? Do you know? Elijah, Elisha.
I forgot. The Yah in Elijah is Yahweh.
Okay.
And Elisha doesn't have that. I can't remember what they mean. Anybody else know what they mean? I could look it up. But...
So similar, I just wondered.
And it seems too that he's anointing not only Elijah, but Hazael and Jehu. What is that commonplace?
He does do that. He anoints all those guys, which is interesting. He anoints foreign kings, and I think it's not so much that he gets to choose. I think it's God sort of telling him these are the people who are going to be coming to power. You know, these are the things that we need to see happening, and these are the people who'll be sort of the folks who are you know, that God wants put in place. And Elisha is sort of, I don't think he has any official capacity to choose those roles other than Elisha. I think he just is able to, he's sort of signifying by his action that these are the people God has chosen. And the way they come to power or come to their positions is going to vary, and it's interesting, and it's, you see that happening during the ministry of Elisha. But
so Elijah means Yahweh is my God.
Yahweh is my God.
And
yes,
Elisha, yeah. God is my salvation.
God is my salvation. So the same root is like Joshua and Elisha. So it's salvation and yeah. Thank you. I know. See, you guys always ask the question I didn't look at. That's all right then. That's all right. That's good. Good. Other people can answer those. So Elijah, after calling Elisha, ministers for quite some time, and we don't know exactly how long, but quite some time after that. And so it's not until 2 Kings chapter 2, and we can turn there, that we see Elisha sort of officially take Elijah's place. And I think we read this, didn't we, in our study of Elijah in chapter 2?
Yeah.
The Lord is going to take Elijah to heaven in a whirlwind. It's not just going to be the typical way a prophet goes out. God's going to literally, take him up to heaven. And Elisha seems to know this, and Elijah keeps saying, I'm going to go here, you stay here. And Elisha will say, no, I want to be with you. I want to stay with you, because Elisha seemingly wants to be there when this happens. And the sons of the prophets, with the prophetic guild, keeps telling Elisha, hey, this is the day, right? And Elisha keeps saying, yeah, I know. Now shut up and I don't want to talk about it. And so eventually, though, that's what happens, but not before Elisha asks Elijah for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. That's in 2 Kings 2, chapter 2, verse 9. Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit. Why a double portion? I want to be twice as good a prophet as you. Is that what he's saying? That's powerful. Firstborn, yes, the firstborn inheritance rights, double portion. And so he's asking, basically, I want to be your heir. I want to be the guy that carries on your ministry, and I'm going to need help in doing that. So let me have a double portion of your spirit. And Elijah says, well, you've asked a difficult thing. That's hard. Some of this other stuff, I guess, was simple. But Elijah says, that's a difficult thing. But if you see me when I'm taken from you, it'll be yours. Otherwise, it will not. And Elisha does see Elijah, the text says in verse 12, taken up to heaven in a whirlwind. And he sees this chariot of fire and horses of fire that appears and separates the two of them. And he watches as Elijah is taken up to heaven in this wind. And he says in verse 12, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel. And Elisha saw him no more. They took hold of his garment and tore it in two in mourning, and then picks up Elijah's cloak. Literally takes up the mantle of the prophet. That chariots and horsemen of Israel thing is interesting. What are some of the possibilities? We don't know for sure what he meant. We can sort of speculate, and maybe we'll see some hints later. But what do you think he meant by that?
What fascinated me was how Elijah parted the Jordan River to cross over. And I think when they got to the center, that's when it taken place.
He does. He does what was done centuries before, but when Israel entered the Promised Land, strikes the water, it divides, and he crosses over. What does that chariots and horsemen of Israel comment mean? What could it mean? What do you suspect? What do you think? You can speculate as well as me. Well, the obvious one, right, is he's just commenting on the fact that this chariot and horse have appeared. That's sort of an obvious way of thinking about it. I suspect there's a little more than that. But we'll maybe defer that until we get a little further into the life of Elisha, but just kind of keep that in mind as we go.
Did it have anything to do with Elisha's newfound power?
Maybe so, or maybe he's making a comment about Elijah himself. We'll chew on some of those things as we move on here. Some of the sons of the prophets want to go look for Elijah. He tries to talk them out of it, but can't, and they go and can't find him. And Elisha says, well, I knew you wouldn't find him. So the first thing that happens in verse 19, they come there, he's at Jericho, and they say, look, our Lord, this town is well situated, but as you can see, but the water is bad and the land is unproductive. Now, what do we know about Jericho? The walls fell down. That was quite.
Then they put a curse on it,
and Joshua
was supposed to rebuild it.
Joshua put a curse on Jericho. Let nobody rebuild it. If they do, it'll be at the cost of their firstborn and secondborn son. And guess what? Somebody rebuilds Jericho, of course, because people are people, right? And in so doing, Kings tells us he loses two sons in the process of building Jericho, rebuilding Jericho. But Jericho exists. Again, it's been rebuilt as this settlement, and the people tell Elisha, look, we got a lot of stuff that's good, but the water's bad. So Elijah says, bring me a new bowl and put salt in it. So they brought it to him. Then he went out to the spring and threw the salt into it, saying, this is what the Lord says. I've healed this water. Never again will it cause death or make the land unproductive. And the water has remained pure to this day, according to the word Elisha had spoken. This day meaning when Kings was, when this was written. So Elisha, now Elisha, one of the things you're going to see about Elisha is a lot of the stuff he does is very practical, day-to-day helping kind of stuff, like this, right? This is a big deal. You've just made a town's water supply safe to drink again. And if you kind of read it with the idea of that curse in the background, one of the things you've done is you've sort of rolled back a curse that God has put on this city. Because, I mean, the people in Jericho now had nothing to do with the people in Jericho centuries ago, right? And so maybe, through Elisha, God is sort of rolling back this curse that has been placed on the city as he purifies this water. But Elisha also does some stuff that's kind of strange, and he does some of these miracles in some ways where you kind of go, why did he do it that way? Why the salt? There's a few other things you'll see. And it seems like maybe some of what he does because this is the way people would have expected it to be done in his day. And Elisha goes along with these things. Maybe it's sort of an acted parable. The prophets do that a lot. They'll do these sort of strange seeming things to accomplish God's will. And in doing so, sort of teach something. And then there's some things that happen in Elisha's life that are just downright odd. And the very next story is one of those. And this is one of
I've
my.
never taught that in Sunday school. Have you, Michelle?
What's the
bear?
The bear. Yeah, this is not
Skip that.
This is one that often gets skipped. Though I did see a T-shirt available online that said, "Respect your elders or be eaten by bears," and kind of like,
I don't do it.
Well, from there, Elisha went up to Bethel. He was walking along the road. Some boys came out of the town and jeered at him. "Get out of here, Baldy," or "Go on up, Baldy." He turned around, looked at them, and called down a curse on them in the name of the Lord. Then 2 bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the bulls. And he went on to Mount Carmel and then returned to Samaria. It's an odd little story for sure, and pretty dark. But I think one of the stories, I mean, what do you take away from this? Let me let you talk about it. What do you take away from this story about Elisha cursing these people and bears coming out and mauling them?
The mention of the alopecia is interesting.
Okay, the baldness, yes. Apparently, Elisha was not a guy with a lot of hair. Elijah, one way to read the descriptions of Elijah is he wore a garment that was hairy. Another way to read it is he was just a hairy guy. And so, it may be sort of a contrast, sort of making fun. And if baldness was sort of associated with weakness, maybe, or something wrong, then maybe that was, or age, then maybe that was what was being mentioned.
Like the story of Samson, I think it shows the potency of God's power.
Yeah.
What it means for God to be with somebody. I think Samson didn't make the best decisions all the time, but he was able to do some amazing things through God's power. We don't know if this was one of the best decisions either, or if it was a gross overreaction, but it shows God's power.
Yeah, I mean, if it was an overreaction, you wonder if God would have sent the bears at all, right? I think there must be something associated with it that is disrespectful to the prophet, which is different than being disrespectful to Elisha in particular. The NIV has "get out of here, Baldy," but other translations will say "go on up," which maybe is sort of, why don't you do what Elijah did? Just go on up. Just get on out of here. Just leave us alone. We don't need a prophet around these parts. That's speculation. We're not really told, and it's hard to sort of put the pieces together. But the fact that God responds in this seemingly drastic way makes you think something's happening here, at least makes me think something's happening here that maybe I'm not real clear on, but must have to do with respect for the prophetic office and thus respect for God and for his word and for listening to him.
The message is don't fool around with life.
Don't mess with Elisha.
Respect him.
But it's still just, I mean, I think we definitely are missing something because they're boys.
Yeah. Now, boy can mean a lot in Hebrew.
Okay.
It can mean like,
again, I think we're missing
young man. It seems drastic. Whoever it is, it seems awfully drastic if it's just, he's mocking the fact that Elisha is kind of a cue ball, but
God spoke to him.
Yeah, and I think it must have to do with that. Though other times God seemingly tolerates bad treatment of prophets. Think about Jezebel executing all those prophets during Elijah's day. So it's a very odd thing. But it's one of the things where I think something's missing, something's lost in translation as we read this story. And by the way, I've never understood it, and I read a bunch of different commentators over the last couple of days, and nobody else understands it either. So I don't feel so bad.
Were these children or young men, were they from the northern kingdom?
Probably from the north, and were they young or boys can mean a lot of different things in Hebrew, kind of like it can in our time. And likely something like teenagers, young adults, maybe, but comparatively young.
Well, if they were from the northern
Youths.
kingdom, then they were influenced by idolatry.
Yeah, I mean, very possibly, and that would lead into or feed into this idea that we don't need a prophet of God. We don't need a prophet of Yahweh around here. We've got everything we need. We're all set in the God department, perhaps. And but again, that doesn't solve all the problems. It's an odd story, but it sort of paints a picture right at the beginning of Elisha, right? He's helpful. He wants to help people with the needs they have, but don't mess with him. Don't cross him. Don't.
That's right.
Perhaps that's kind of what we're supposed to take away from it. That's about the best I got on that story. But
I wonder what
and that's why we don't teach it in Sunday school too, because
I just want to see the playground the next day.
right. Right.
I wonder why she bears.
Yeah, it does mention she bears. Yes, they're women. They're women. Female bears. The bears are women. Yes, I don't know why. I don't know why specifically she bears. I think she bears can be pretty ferocious if they're defending cubs. So maybe it's an idea of ferocity, right? That they're particularly
Okay.
ferocious animals.
I just looked at a couple different versions, and it's interpreted like small boys or young children.
It can
definitely is.
It can be. Yeah, it can be. It can mean a lot of different things.
I don't know.
Yeah, it can mean a lot of different things. Yeah,
bizarre.
Yeah, it can mean a lot of different things. But yeah, I mean that's one way to read it. It's a weird story. I'm telling you, it's really odd. So chapter 4 of 2 Kings, we pick up some of Elisha's story. This is the story about, and there's several similar stories of Elisha helping women in difficult circumstances, or we'll look at several of them. In chapter 4, verse 1, you have the wife of a man from the company of the prophets. Again, the company of the prophets, there was a prophetic school in Elisha's day, and they were a guild of prophets. It doesn't necessarily mean they were like, getting a degree. It just means they were a guild of prophets who had some sort of community together. And the wife of one of those men comes to Elisha and says, husband's dead. You know that he revered the Lord. Now his creditor is coming to take my 2 boys as his slaves. So we had Elisha getting some boys eaten by bears, but now we're going to have Elisha saving a couple of boys, right? Servant has nothing here at all except a small jar of oil. Elisha said, go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. Then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to the side. So you get the picture, right? She's got this small amount of olive oil. She's supposed to go to all her neighbors, borrow as many jars as she can, and then start pouring oil into the jars.
This is a fun.
This is a fun one. This is a fun Sunday school one, right? You can do
right.
all kinds, right? And she pours and she pours and she pours, and over again, the jars are filled. Verse 6, she says to her son, bring me another one. But he replied, there's not a jar left. And then the oil stopped flowing. By the way, I heard a sermon one time. If only this woman had had enough faith to gather more jars. Well, that's not very nice, and that's not very helpful. And this poor woman gathered all the jars she could, apparently, because Elisha told her to. So I don't like that sermon at all, and I think that whoever came up with that one needs to rethink that. But Because this woman does what she can, right? She goes and gets as many jars as she can get. There are a finite number of jars in the world, and she gets as many jars as she can and fills them with oil. And Elisha then says, "Go sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what's left."
So she had enough.
She had enough, right, Pam? She had plenty. Whoever preached that sermon was maybe a little selfish, a little greedy.
Gotta watch out for bears.
And better watch out for bears. So then there's another story about the place, the land, the town of Shunem. Elisha goes and visits a widow there, and he urged visits a woman who was there, I'm sorry, who urged him to stay for a meal, and he does, and it becomes sort of a pattern. Whenever he's in the town of Shunem, he runs by this house. She and her husband say, "Let's make a small room on the roof, sort of the flat roof, Middle Eastern architecture, and put a bed and a table, a chair, and a lamp for him. He can stay there whenever he comes to us." So they make a guest room for Elisha. There's nothing much more hospitable than that, right? I don't believe, other than my mother, I don't believe anybody has made a guest room for me in their house, just for me, right? And so this woman makes this guest room for Elisha to stay in when he's there. So he begins speaking with his servant Gehazi. The woman says, "I don't need anything." Elisha wants to repay her for her hospitality. The woman says, "I don't need anything. I'm happy to do it." And Elisha says to Gehazi, his servant, "What can we do?" And Gehazi said, "She has no son, and her husband is old." So there's a problem, right? One day she's probably going to be a widow, and she's got no son to look after her, because in that culture that was important, that was necessary. So he called her, and she stood in the doorway. "About this time next year, you'll hold a son in your arms." She's like, "Oh, you don't tell me that." I don't want to get that much hope. It's kind of touching, isn't it? She's like, don't mislead me. Don't mess with me. This is obviously something that's probably a sore spot for her, and a spot of something missing in her life, and she doesn't want to get her hopes up. But that's what happens. The child grew, and one day he went out to his father, verse 18, who was with the reapers. He said to his father, "My head, my head." He has some sort of medical emergency, and he dies. So you have this, I mean, poor woman, right? She's not been able to have a son. Now she has a son, and now God's seemingly taken her son from her. But she goes up and she lays him on Elisha's bed. And she says, "I gotta go talk to Elisha." So she takes off, comes to Elisha at Mount Carmel, and eventually gets to them. Verse 27, she reached the man of God at the mountain. She took hold of his feet. Gehazi came over to push her away, but the man of God said, "Leave her alone. She's in bitter distress, but the Lord has hidden it from me. He has not told me why." It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Elisha maybe a lot of times is sort of used to knowing what's going on, just being able to tell. But in this case, the woman, he doesn't know why. And she says, "Did I ask you for a son, my Lord? Didn't I tell you don't raise my hopes?" Elisha tells Gehazi to run ahead. "Don't stop, and lay my staff on the boy's face." The woman makes sure that Elisha comes with her. I don't know if Elisha is thinking that maybe he can heal remotely through his staff or just what, but the woman won't have it, and she's insisting Elisha come along with her. And Elisha, verse 33, he goes in, he shuts the door on the two of them, and he prayed to the Lord. Then he got on the bed and lay on the boy, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands. As he stretched himself out on him, the boy's body grew warm. Elisha turned away and walked back and forth in the room, and then got on the bed and stretched out on him once more. The boy sneezed, might be the word, coughed, even convulsed. There's several different things it could be. It's a word that only appears there in the Hebrew. Whatever he did it 7 times and opened his eyes. Elisha summoned Gehazi and said, call the Shunammite, and he did. When she came, he said, take your son. She came in, fell at his feet, and bowed to the ground. Then she took her son and went out. Another time when he helps, he raises someone from the dead. This is not the only time Elisha raises someone from the dead. What's the other time? Anybody know? Did you happen to read it?
With the widow woman, or are you talking about in the grave?
the grave. He raises somebody post-mortem.
Right.
Accidentally. He's being buried well, he's buried and a guy's burying someone else, and I guess Elisha's grave is still open, his tomb is still open and available, and he tosses the guy in with Elisha, and when the guy touches Elisha, the guy stands up. The guy raises from the dead. It's crazy. So Elisha has some interesting stuff.
It reminds me of the miracles that Jesus did in the New Testament.
Yeah. Yeah, I very, very similar. We're going to see one that's a feeding miracle here, but the resurrection miracle, it sounds a lot like Jairus' daughter, right? Jairus is insisting that Jesus come along with, come with me. He's pulling Jesus through the crowd to get to his daughter. And Jesus goes along and heals. The difference, of course, in the resurrection miracles of Jesus is a whole lot easier, right? For Jesus. There's no stretching out. There's no, walk pacing around. It's a long process. Jesus just says, Lazarus, come out. He says, little girl, get up.
Right.
So, but it's very similar, and it's intended to demonstrate how powerful Elisha is and what God does through Elisha. And we can't ever lose the fact, right, that it's God working through him in all of these situations.
Right.
Chapter 4, there's a famine in Gilgal, and company of the prophets is meeting with him. He says to his servant, put on the large pot, cook some stew for these prophets. Even feed some of these guys, but they're hungry, and everybody gets excited and they start gathering stuff, and somebody gathers stuff that's poisonous, apparently. Some gourds that no one knew what they were. Let this be a lesson. If you take nothing else away, don't cut up a bunch of gourds and throw them in your soup if you don't know what they are. What happened? And the response is, there is death in the pot, and they could not eat it. And Elisha says, get some flour, just like the salt with the water, right? And serve it to the people to eat. There was nothing harmful in the pot. The next miracle is a feeding miracle. Man comes bringing 20 loaves of barley bread. Give it to the people to eat, Elisha said. How can I set this before 100 men? His servant asked. But Elisha said, give it to the people to eat, for this is what the Lord said. They will eat and have some left over. But he set it before them, and they ate and had some left over, according to the word of the Lord.
Are these people who are following Elijah around?
It seems like with the stew, it's the company of the prophets. It's the prophetic guild. In the next one, it's not really specified, but probably it's the same group, I would guess.
I think it was the young prophets.
Yeah. It seems like it's the same group. It's similar to Jesus's feeding miracle, but of course Jesus does more with less, right? And you'd expect that, I guess.
You can see why people thought this was.
Yeah, I mean, if they were familiar with these stories, right, you can see why a feeding miracle would make a splash, as it did. Chapter 5 is probably the best known story of Elisha, the story of Naaman. Naaman is not an Israelite. Naaman is a soldier in the army of Aram. And that means probably he had fought Israelites. In fact, we're pretty sure he fought some Israelites because he has a little Israelite slave girl. And whether she's a little girl or a young woman or whatever, Aram had gone out and taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. She said to her, Naaman has leprosy. And she says to her mistress, if only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy. King of Aram says, absolutely, you should go. I'll send a letter to the king of Israel because that's how things get done. I'm going to send you with a lot of treasure. The king of Israel, unspecified which one it is, but in verse 7, reads the letter and he's upset. And he thinks that the king of Aram is trying to sort of goad him into a confrontation of some sort, right? He's trying to create some bad blood between them. But Elisha hears about this and says, have the man come to me and he'll know that there is a prophet in Israel. Great line, right? We're going to show him what prophets are all about, what Israel's all about. So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger to him. Notice that. Well-respected army officer who we find out, or what we know, is an assistant to the king. I mean, he's higher up. He's high up there, right? He comes to this prophet, and the prophet doesn't even have time to come see him. Just sends a messenger to him. Now, what does a messenger tell him to do? You know this story, right? What does a messenger tell him to do?
Go wash 7 times in the Jordan.
Dip yourself 7 times in the Jordan River. And like everybody who thinks the best water in the world is the water from home, he says, we got better rivers in Damascus. Why have I come all the way here to get a message from the prophet telling me to go dunk myself in the Jordan? Verse 11, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the spot and cure me of my leprosy. That's the key, isn't it? I thought this is what he would do. Yeah, has God ever surprised you? God ever done things differently than the way you thought he would do them?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we have these expectations, don't we? We kind of come into our prayers and we come into our relationship with God sort of assuming some things sometimes. And God doesn't always do what we expect. In fact, sometimes it seems like he goes out of his way to do what we don't expect. Verse 13, fortunately, the servants have cooler heads. And the servants come to Naaman in verse 13. My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, washed and be cleansed? So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times as the man of God had told him, and his flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. And Naaman and a young boy who hasn't been mauled by bears. Then Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God. He stood before him and said, now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. I think he becomes a monotheist. This might be a little bit of a hyperbole and exaggeration, kind of saying he's the most powerful God. He's the only one that does anything. He's the only one. But it sounds like what he says is there's no other God than the one in Israel. And he says, a key thing, he says, please accept a gift from your servant, which Elisha refuses. But then Naaman says, okay, could you give me as much earth as I can carry? I want to carry earth from Israel. It can also mean like clay for bricks. He wants to build an altar. Now, what the earth has to do with it, whether he's building the altar on this earth from Israel or whether he's building it out of clay or clay bricks is kind of impossible to say. But the point is, give me earth from Israel so that I can go back and build an offering to God, and I'll never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other God but the Lord. He says, but I do need a condition on this. I've got to take the king into the temple of Rimmon, which is a Syrian, Aramean god. And he says, I got to go with him there. That's part of my job. But other than that, I'm never going to darken the door of another temple, and I'm just going to sacrifice and worship God. And Elisha says, go in peace.
You think the Lord was happy with that excuse? Or?
Elisha says, go in peace. Maybe it's one of those things where God says, well, you got to do what you got to do. I don't know, but Elisha does not give him any reason to think that he shouldn't be at peace with this decision, this choice.
I mean, probably think of situations where exigencies suggest we do some things we're uncomfortable with, and the question, you have the courage to say, absolutely no, regardless of the consequences, or do you kind of go along and say, in my heart, I'm not with this?
Yeah, and I think people are going to answer that in different ways, in different circumstances.
That's one of the implicit lessons of the famous story of the fiery furnace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. I mean, it's an open question. And I don't think you ought to take lightly those situations, for sure. And maybe God makes some allowances because Naaman's new to this, right? He hasn't been a servant of God for very long, and he's not an Israelite. Interesting thing, it's maybe relevant or maybe has something to say. I was reading recently about the idea during the Holocaust that Jewish people, if they chose not to reveal that they were Jewish to save their lives and the lives of their families, that was okay. That was sort of regarded by the rabbis and regarded as that's all right. That's a choice that you've made, and you don't need to feel sorrow over that or guilt over that. But then, of course, a lot of times people do stand up for their faith and die for it, and stand up for their faith. And I don't know the answer. I just know that Elisha seems to say here, go in peace. It's okay. What were you going to say?
Go ahead.
Scriptural support for drawing the line when you have to, but not necessarily having to precipitate the confrontation.
Yeah. Jesus said, "Pay your taxes," right? Pay your taxes. No sense in causing problems. Pay your taxes to Caesar. Pay your, get along with the government. What Paul said, get along with the government when you can. There's no reason to buy trouble. Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Just some of the Vietnamese young adults, like when they got married, I think, I'm not sure, it might have been here in the United States or when they went to when they went to Vietnam to get married. Some of them like bowed before the altar of the ancestor or whatever. I mean, they really didn't believe that there was, but kind of like politics, it's kind of like politics, with the families or whatever. And okay, politics.
Yeah. People have to make those tough choices, and I don't know. I don't know if I would have done any differently if I was in Naaman's place there, for sure. That king can make a lot of trouble for me, I guess. and who knows? Maybe Naaman in a future date got a little more courage and did say something to the king. Who knows? Well, we're running out of time. Gehazi, of course, chases down Naaman and says, I think you mentioned a reward, right? and Naaman says, oh, sure. And so Gehazi decides he's going to enrich himself a little bit. And problem is Elisha knows. and Gehazi winds up with leprosy, which is Again, kind of harsh, but again, you don't fool with this stuff, right? This is not something you play with. This is not something you cheat. You don't try to cheat God. You don't try to sell his favor.
It gives credibility to the word.
Yeah.
Okay. The prophets aren't lying. All right. And like I said last week, they're heading into the exile, and all this is just confirming the prophetic word. What God wasn't lying when he said, what he said. Okay.
Yeah. If they're selling prophetic favors, right? That undermines a lot. That means he's for sale. That means he's just one of those guys that'll say whatever enriches him. And Elisha doesn't want to be perceived that way, and doesn't want to undermine his witness that way. There's a lot more about Elisha you can read on if you want to. I included some other texts in your email this morning, but we'll conclude with 2 Kings 13, verse 14. Now Elisha had been suffering from the illness from which he died. Jehoash, king of Israel, went down to see him and wept over him. My father, he cried, the chariots and horsemen of Israel. I just like that symmetry, right? Elisha's ministry begins and ends with the phrase, the chariots and horsemen of Israel. What do you think that means? I think it means that the prophet is the power of Israel. The prophet is the chariots and the horsemen, not the army, not the economy, the prophet, as he proclaims the word of God, and as he's faithful to God's work, and as he's a channel for God's power and God's compassion and God's judgment. He is the army. He is the power in Israel.
Well, in chapter 6,
yes,
verse 17, that the army of Israel is like surrounded, or they think that they're in, and Elisha prayed, "Oh Lord, open his eyes so that he may see." Then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked and saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire, all around Elisha. So, yeah.
Yep. Elisha says, those who are for us are greater than those who are against us. And then let him see, Lord. And he sees all this army, this heavenly army gathered around. I think that's what Elisha was saying about Elijah. How are we going to get by when the chariots and horsemen of Israel gone? And I think the king is saying the same thing as Elisha does. How are we going to survive? How are we going to make it with the chariots and horsemen of Israel gone? And after that is shortly they're burying a guy and throw him into Elisha's tomb, and lo and behold, he wakes up. Well, thanks very much for your comments and your thoughts. Elisha's an interesting guy. As I said, there's a lot more. So if you haven't yet, you might read some of those other stories about Elisha. We weren't able to touch on all of them, but interesting guy, interesting time in Israel's history, interesting time in the world. And Elisha was kind of right there in the middle of it, apparently. Good to see everyone. Thanks for your thoughts and your comments. And
thank you.
Thank you. Everyone have a good evening.
Good night, everybody.